ayudar a los decisores a discernir los delicados asuntos concernientes al capital intelectual de estos litigios. En lugar de ello, les diré un par de cosas. Primero, cuando nos aventuramos en un territorio desconocido, como lo hicieron los descubridores de épocas pasadas, fueran selvas tropicales, fueran cumbres inaccesibles anteriormente, fueran espacios submarinos, lo que fueran, podíamos siempre encontrarnos con realidades maravillosas, inéditas, o con peligros mortales. Cuando nos adentramos en la economía del conocimiento, podemos igual, dado que se trata de espacios no conocidos para la experiencia humana, dado que por primera vez operamos en una realidad en la que ya no son los objetos físicos sobre las cuales nuestra cultura para todo el planeta, nuestra cultura industrial del siglo pasado, sus instituciones, sus roles, sus leyes, sus términos de propiedad están fundados. Al adentrarnos nosotros en una realidad en la que son las representaciones de esos objetos y por lo tanto en la que privan nuevos principios, nuevas leyes que nos son desconocidas al día de hoy, más nos vale tener un guía ampliamente experimentado. Más nos vale tener a alguien que se haya aventurado en estos territorios y que haya comenzado a moverse y haya regresado con vida de ellos. Pues podemos sentirnos afortunados de contar con la guía de Patrick Sullivan para introducirnos a estas nuevas realidades. Finalmente, solo quiero mencionar a nombre de la ADIAT que estamos singularmente agradecidos, Patrick, por tu singular disposición, no solamente para haber aceptado venir gentilmente a obsequiarnos esta presentación, por haberlo hecho también a nivel con el taller del día de ayer, y también de haber accedido a esas tareas preparatorias con total disposición y gentileza, como el mismo día de hoy, con esta bonomía, a acomodarse a las vicisitudes del programa. A nombre de la ADIAT y de nuestro auditorio, Patrick, muchas gracias, muy bienvenido, and the floor is yours.
Buenos días, señoras y señores. Es mi placer estar aquí. And now I will shift to English for all of the reasons that we all understand. We're here to talk about intellectual capital. And I've been involved in this field since about 1987. And I became involved when I read a paper by a professor from Berkeley about how you can make money out of patents. My background, as some of you may know, is I've been a business consultant for quite a long time. Before that, I was an engineer. And my graduate training has been in business and economics. So as an economist, I was just fascinated by this idea that you could make money out of patents. I mean, I live in the Silicon Valley area, and people have been making a lot of money out of patents for a very long time. But it was never clear to me how they did it. And this professor's paper laid out the steps you go through to extract value, dollar value, from a patent. I was fascinated by that. So for me, intellectual capital was really around things like technological knowledge and know-how, and patents or copyrights. And I met Leif Edmondson, and he and I became colleagues and friends, and a number of other people from different aspects of the intellectual capital movement. And it was interesting to me because as I talked with them, their view of intellectual capital was very, very different from mine. And I respected their view, but I didn't understand it and didn't agree with it. And I had to think through, how could their view, I respect these people, I respect their intellect, how could their view be so wrong? And yes, I respect them. How can this be? But in 1994, several of us got together. All of us were interested in intellectual capital, but we didn't really know. We couldn't agree on what it was. And we said, well, and I said, well, I think it's got to do with making money. So we decided to get together all the large corporations in the world at that time who were actively making money from their intellectual capital. And we could identify 12 large companies who were doing it. And we invited them to a meeting in January of 1995, and 7 of them actually were able to come. And in that meeting, we came up with our own definition of intellectual capital, there being no standard definition at the time. And of course, clearly, from my perspective, it had to be right because I was involved in doing it, so obviously. But I want to talk a bit about that because that group of people were all people from business, and they're all people whose job involved creating profits out of the company's intangibles. Now, where am I? The group met in January of 1995, and one of the first things that it did was it had to come up with a definition of intellectual capital. In the course of doing that, we had a lot of conversations back and forth, and we had to define some terms and so forth so we could communicate with each other. The group had such a great experience meeting with each other, meeting with people who clearly were friends. We understood what we were all trying to do. The group decided to meet again, and after the second meeting, it wanted to meet again. So we have been meeting now for 3 times a year for the past 17 years and teaching each other how to make more money out of our intangibles. Intangibles now being the word that, at least in my circles, is the word that has replaced intellectual capital. The companies who are involved in this effort, here are some of the logos from some of the companies. The slide isn't completely up to date, but you get the idea. These are large companies mostly. They're companies with well-known names, and they have been making an immense amount of profits out of their intellectual capital or intangibles. The group has decided early on that what it wanted to do was create knowledge about how to do this, create its own intellectual capital, and that it wanted to share that knowledge. Out of this effort has come 5 books, dozens and dozens and dozens of articles and professional papers in journals. And so we're going to talk a bit about intellectual capital from the perspective, entirely from a business perspective. So when we went to the first meeting and we said, what is intellectual capital? We decided that for our purposes, intellectual capital is knowledge that can be converted into profit. Okay? And it turned out that it was one of those dumb, smart definitions that was exactly on target, and we've kept it over the years. And I was the one that walked up to the whiteboard and I drew a box. And I said, if that box is intellectual capital, what do you suppose is inside the box? What are the major things in the box? And we all talked for a while. And we decided that the first major thing in the box was tacit knowledge. The things that are in your head. The second major thing that was in the box was codified knowledge. When you took tacit knowledge and you typed something into your computer, or you wrote down on a page, or you drew a diagram, or a blueprint, or a painting, if you somehow committed your knowledge to a form of media, you codified it. Now, codified knowledge has as one small subset the portion of codified knowledge that is legally protected, and that goes by the legal term intellectual property. We say, so that's intellectual capital as far as we're concerned. Now, the stuff in the blue portion of the box is all of the other elements of intellectual capital that are quite important, but when your purpose is making profits from intellectual capital, they are secondary. The primary ones are the ones that are in the front. Okay? So going back to my earlier concern about how could I reconcile my view of intellectual capital with that of my friends. A way to think about that was, suppose I had a whole pile of colored balloons, and I put them right here on the floor. And each balloon represented some piece of the thing called intellectual capital: knowledge, know-how, structural capital. Every balloon was a bit or a piece of the thing called intellectual capital. And then suppose I look down at it from the top. If I look down at it from the top, it makes the slides work easier. If you look down at it from the top, then you might say, suppose there was an investor looking into that stack of balloons called the intellectual capital stack. Or suppose there was, oops, shouldn't have done that. Suppose there was someone who was interested in creating more knowledge or creating more inventions or innovations. They might be someone like me interested in, the internal performance reporting is someone like the chief financial officer of the company. They have to report out on the financial statements about this, so they want to know what it is. And then you have folks like me who are interested in how do you get the value out. Now, depending upon where you stand, you see different elements. You see different things of intellectual capital in your foreground and different things in your background. So if you're looking at it from the perspective of an investor, the intellectual capital of the company looks something like that. Investors are concerned mostly with the financial measurement aspect of intellectual capital. They're concerned with the people, they're concerned with the products and services, and so forth, and you can read the slide. But if you were to walk around that circle and look at it from the perspective of a knowledge or innovation person, you'd see an entirely different set of things in the foreground and other things in the background. And you keep on going. If you look at the chief financial officer, you can't talk to them. Have you noticed? And if you look at it from a perspective like mine, then you see something else. And the point of this is to say that all definitions of intellectual capital are different. And they're all correct. I'll say it again. They're all different, and they're all correct. So we don't have to debate any longer whose is right, because this is such a big, complicated mess of things that it's impossible for us to get our arms around it. No one person can do that. No one view can do that. So I'm going to talk today from my view, just so that you all know kind of like what my bias is. Now, there are many definitions of intellectual capital, of not only the words, but sort of what does it contain. So if you asked my colleagues in the ICM gathering group of companies, they'd come up with a list like that. That's a list. There's, in the United States, the Federal Accounting Standards Board has come up with its list of what it calls intangibles. And this list looks like that. That's another list. And I'm sure if I asked anyone in the audience, I would get another list, and another list. And they're all correct and they're all different. Because each list reflects what is important to us individually as a beholder. So intellectual capital has all these different meanings. Just pick the one that's important to you because that's the one that you're working with. Now, another point before we get too deep into this, I want to talk about is the difference between invention and innovation. And this is really important. This is a gathering definition that I know a number of you hold and others of you may not have thought about. Invention is the creation of the idea in your head. It's that little bit of insight that you get. And there's invention, and then often you have to move to proving the concept by further research, and then creating an alpha version of whatever the device or project may be, and then the beta version. You go through all of that stuff. That's a part of the invention process. But invention is only the idea. Innovation is something very, very different in my world.